First we'll start by pulling the cup holders directly up. This exposes the tray that is held in with two Phillips head screws. Once the screws are removed, you can pull the tray straight up. Now open the lid, use both hands to pull the console directly up and move it back, and this is where it can stay for the rest of the install. Now we start to remove the dash, first popping the trim cover off, pushing it directly up using the trim tool, two gentle clips, take it away, use the same trim tool to remove the silver surround around the buttons, just by gently working your way around the trim. It is a little bit fragile, so just be careful not to mark the dash or the trim piece itself. Now that's pulled forward, use your Torx bit to remove the two Torx screws that hold the top of that panel in. Using the same trim tool, get in behind the trim and give it a good solid firm pull. It will take a little bit of work on each side, but should come straight out of the dash. Now you can unplug the connector just by squeezing in the tab. Now we move back down to the bottom of the trim and pop the two wing pieces off, firmly pulling from the bottom. These can be quite tight with the three metal clips on each side. And the top section just clips up under the dash, so definitely pull these from the bottom, and the driver's side on this one was particularly tight. Once it's released, you can pull it forward and twist it, and here you need to disconnect the plug from the back of the start button because it is very short. Once that's connected, you can twist the vent, just watching the steering wheel, and the whole panel comes out in one piece. Now it's out, you can start using your Torx bit to remove the 4 screws that hold the factory screen bezel in. 2 at the bottom and 2 at the top. Now that the screws are all removed, you can lift this panel forward, again starting from the bottom, pull the bottom out and then let it fall down and drop out from under the leading edge of the dash. This plug has got a clip release, so you need to push in with your thumb and then effectively push the hinge back over the clip. Once that's done, that will pull straight out of the back of the screen. Now we move to the lower section of the dash. Pulling the lower trim forward, you can just unclip the trim there. There's 2 screws on either side of the ashtray drawer, and then another 4 screws on each side of the control panel. Basically work up each side, remove all the screws, and then pop the trim forward. While we're dismantling the car, we'll also do the left-hand pillar for the microphone. Remove the left-hand trim. This is the same as the wings on the side of the radio, and then work your way up the pillar. Using your trim tool, just pop the SRS airbag latch forward, and then there'll be a T30 Torx bit in behind that. Once you've removed the Torx bit, you can now just work the pillar away from the roof liner and then pull it directly up from the dash. While we're there, we may as well run the microphone. We find the easiest way for this is to tuck it into the corner of the roof lining, slowly and gently work it across, and typically with installation we mount that just to the driver's side of the rear view mirror. You can then tuck the microphone wire down the A-pillar. You'll see there's lots of existing cables in there, so it's very easy to accommodate that without causing any problems. At the bottom of the A-pillar you need to just tuck it into the air vent, back of the air vent hole. And in this case we've just got a little nylon strap that we use to pull it past the glove box. At home you might need to be creative with this, coat hanger, anything stiff that will get through. Obviously just be careful not to catch any of the wiring, and particularly careful of the airbag that's in the dash. But if you stay just directly above the glove box, you're well and truly out of the way of anything that might cause any concern. Pull the microphone across, pull it to length and tuck it in, ready for connecting. Now we can move on to getting the components ready for the dash. With this installation, we do actually remove the old radio unit. This gives us a lot more room in the dash for the new modules. It can stay in for the earlier vehicles, but particularly with these later model vehicles we do remove it. That's just 2 Torx bits. Take the radio module out and put the bracket aside ready for refitment into the vehicle later on. We'll then take the factory screen. We just need to remove the 2 clips off the bottom of that to retain our screws. Just a small flat blade screwdriver, work it under the edge, pop them forward, and once they come off you can then actually clip them onto the new fascia. Just keep note that you do install them the correct way up, which is exactly the same way they come off, and they've got that little retaining clip on them to hold them in place so they don't fall into the dash. Once they're in place, you can turn the fascia over and now mount your aftermarket unit. Just make sure that's the correct way up here. Obviously the large flange at the bottom of this screen is the bottom of the radio, and in this case the Pioneer screen is also the correct way up. There's now 4 screws that will line up. These can basically be screwed. First, just start them all. Once that's done, you can then turn the unit over, check it for alignment, and then proceed to tighten these screws. They don't need to be super tight, just enough to bite up on the plastic. Now that that's all tight, set it aside and we're ready to start connecting the harness to the car. First things, fish out the main harnesses from the vehicle. This one will be your main power connector, the connector that was on the back of the factory screen, your antenna, and in this case this vehicle is also equipped with the factory USB. This should be fairly straightforward in terms of the connectors coming with the loom that we provide. First is the power connector. Second is the FACRA antenna adapter. These can be a little bit fiddly, just make sure the key is the right way up, and as you can see here sometimes they just take a little bit of wiggling to clip in, but you should get a nice firm click. And the final main part of the connection here is connecting up the factory screen plug, and as you can see here the little swing gate starts open and finishes closed and locks that together. Once that's all connected, take the module, tuck it into the back of the dash. We provide some cable ties that can actually be fed down between the dash brace and a plastic bracket. This is to help hold the module in place. As this is a 2011 vehicle with a small screen without the buttons, it does have an additional speaker which helps retain the factory chimes and also the parking sensors, which we just secure to one of the cross braces here so it doesn't rattle in the dash. Once that's done, we can now actually reconnect the key transponder fob and mount the original radio bracket back onto the dash. Again, this is just using 4 of the T20 Torx screws. In some cases we can leave the radio module in the car, but in this case we just find it gives much more room for the cables if we remove it. One more connection to make with this one is the USB adapter. Again, this is typical of the later model vehicles. The early model cars do not have a factory USB. Once all the wiring in, just tuck it up in a gentle bundle and put a cable tie around it to stop rattling. Now we just make sure all the connectors are available to be plugged in. Being a Pioneer unit, we've got a microphone, a camera harness, the USB and the main power adapter. This has been pre-wired for a camera. We also have an AM/FM antenna. Basically start by working through, there's no particular sequence here. Main power harness, obviously now the video and RCAs. RCAs aren't used in this application, but they are all on the one connector that has the reverse camera. This is the USB being plugged in. We have the microphone. Just check when you're plugging that in that is in fact going into the microphone hole. On some units the steering wheel control adapter and the microphone are the same size, so just make sure that you are plugging those into the correct locations. You'll finally just need to fish out the steering wheel control adapter, which is hanging off the top of the module we supplied, and that plugs in on this particular unit right next to the microphone. AM/FM antenna also needs to be plugged in, and this unit, having wireless CarPlay, does have a GPS antenna. With the case of this car, we do actually just stick that to the top of the radio unit. It does have a good clear view straight through the plastic dash, straight to the GPS. Mounting the screen is simply a matter of tucking the cabling in as you go, and putting the top of this bracket in first, allowing it to work its way up behind the dash, and then clipping in the bottom. Once it's in place, we do find it easier to put the top screws in first, one on each side, and then 2 screws can be added to the bottom. Now that the screen's all mounted, it's time to test the basic functions of the unit. To do this, we remove the start button from the trim, which just pushes straight out, plug it back into the vehicle, and once it's plugged in, press the ignition on. Now we just test for basic functions, microphone, USB connectivity, sound, and we'll do a more detailed video of how to set up the units. Once that's done, it's time to put it back together. We start with the low control panel, clipping in at the bottom and then rolling it forward onto the dash, lining it up with the screws. And just work your way through the 8 T20 Torx screws to reassemble that component. Don't forget the 2 down the bottom on either side of the ashtray. Because we haven't put the radio unit back in the dash of this car, you'll end up with 4 spare screws, so don't be concerned. Once the screws are in, you can now clip the trim on above the tray. Check it for clearance to make sure it's not binding up, and then you can reassemble the side wings. We've put the start button back into this wing, twist it into position, plug the start button in, push the top of the trim up under the dash, and then push it down at the bottom for the 3 metal clips to align. Now's a good chance to pull the cable out for the button control, just so that it doesn't fall down behind the dash. The left hand wing can also be assembled, top in first, and then push it in and clip at the bottom. Clip in the button assembly. That will just push straight into the dash on the 4 metal clips, and now you can put the 2 Torx bits straight back in the top of the dash. Once they're all tight, we can now push the metal trim back around the buttons. Just make sure that's all nice and square. Don't push it too hard on any particular corner, just gently work it around so it goes in square, and then the cover piece goes back over the top of the screws and you're done. Last thing is reassembling the console. We just put a blanket on it throughout the install just to make sure we don't scratch it. Very easy to put it back in, tuck it in at the front, and then clip it down at the bottom. Next step is to refit the tray. Just remember that these are 2 Phillips head screws, which is important because that tray can be removed at service as an emergency handbrake cover, so the Torx bits are problematic. Once they're nipped up, refit the cup holders, clip those down, shut the lid, and now it's time to program.